two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Paul Ortiz. He teaches in ILR at Cornell. We're going to be talking about Latinx workers and their activism both in the past and in the present. Paul, maybe just for starters, do you want to say any words about your own involvement in anything like this? You don't have.
Yes. So in my life, I've had, I'm working on kind of two parallel lines, as it were. So I started as a labor organizer in the late 1980s, and my first job was really with the United Farm Workers Union, a long campaign to unionize the Chateau Saint Michel vineyards. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the Chateau Saint Michel wines. All the workers who were vineyard workers in the late 80s, early 90s were Latinx, primarily Mexican American, some from Central America who tended the vines, worked incredibly hard, didn't have a union. We finally won that campaign in 1995, and there's been a continuous union contract at Chateau Saint Michel wineries since 1995. And so that was my introduction to the labor movement. Growing up in a union friendly background, but not really understanding or appreciating unions. That catapulted me to graduate school, and where I studied to become a labor historian, among other types of histories, Latino history, Latin American, African American, social movement history. So when we talk about Latinx workers activism, I'm still involved in the movement, even as a labor history professor at Cornell. But I feel like teaching the history of these freedom struggles in many ways is just as important as contemporary activism, because what I find is that people who don't know their history of activism and struggle are people who are kind of rootless. They feel disempowered, they feel helpless. And when you teach them that they have a history of struggle, and everyone has a history of struggle somewhere in their family, they feel more empowered. They feel, hey, I can change things. I don't just have to listen to the boss or to the government. I can actually shake things up a little bit. But that requires, a little study. So that's why I'm a big proponent as a labor activist of being a historian as well.
What role have Latinx workers played in the labor movement historically? You mentioned
Well,
one thing.
yeah, well, Latinx workers have been central as long as there has been a labor movement, Teresa. And we go back to the 19th century, and there's different ways that we have been referred to, of course. I mean, Latinx now is just the latest term. When I was growing up, it was Chicano or Mexicano, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Dominican. We're from many different countries, in addition to Mexico, although the Anglo majority often reduces us to a Mexican identity. But as long as you had unions in this country, whether it was the Knights of Labor in the 19th century, the early 19th century labor parties, the National Labor Union in the 1860s after the Civil War, you've had Hispanic workers played central roles, Mexican workers in the Southwest. Increasingly in the late 19th, early 20th century, Puerto Rican workers, especially in cities like Passaic, Camden, New Jersey, New York City, the Bronx, Queens. And so Latinx workers have been central to both being rank and file in terms of the type of crafts that they did. They were iron workers back in the day. They helped build the Brooklyn Bridge. Mexican workers helped build the railroads all throughout the Southwest and the West Coast, along with their Chinese and Irish comrades. And so when I say we, of course, I have many,
Mhm.
many ancestors who were involved in those different types of labor movements. I had great uncles who were involved in the Little Steel Strike. during the Great Depression. I had immediate uncles who were very involved in the labor movement in the 60s and 70s. And so, yeah, we've been everywhere. And without Latinx workers, it's hard to even imagine there being a labor movement. And, one last example is the Great Depression. So the Great Depression for Latinx people in this country was kind of a double-edged sword. There was a terrible tragedy in the midst of that, which is that initially, because of the turmoil of the Great Depression, Mexican Americans were blamed for the economic downturn by members of the Hoover cabinet. Because as we all know, capitalists hate to admit mistakes. If something goes wrong in capitalism, it's like it's got to be the Mexicans, it's got to be the women, it's got to be the blacks, right? And so Mexicans took a lot of the blame for the Great Depression, and so there's a massive deportation and banishment even of many Mexican American citizens. A lot of what's going on today, Teresa, was happening in the 30s as well. And so many people were banished, deported, even American citizens to the Caribbean, to Central America. So that was kind of the bad side. The good side was that Mexican, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban American workers organized more than ever. And if you look at the key unions, for example, for the CIO, or the Committee for Industrial Organizing, if you look at the packing house workers, if you look at the steel workers, if you look at the auto workers, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban American workers were central to those union organizing campaigns, especially in the Southwest and the Northeast and Florida as well. For example, I'm looking right now, Teresa, because I teach at the ILR, I'm right around the corner from one of the world's great labor history archives. And it's so exciting. I'm looking at a campaign now in the early 1960s. Leon Davis was the president of the Hospital Workers 1199. He was a prominent Jewish American labor activist. And if you look at the Hospital Workers Union organizing in the 60s in New York, it was all about African Americans and Puerto Rican organizing. Puerto Rican leadership was key to the rise of 1199. Malcolm X got involved in the 1962. There was a big strike at Brookwood Hospital. Some of your New York City listeners will know the names Brookwood, Beth Israel. Those hospitals have changed names over the years. That's what they were called back in the day. Leon Davis, the president of 1199, was actually jailed. He went to jail for 30 days during the strike for violating an anti-labor injunction. And a lot of Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Black workers were jailed and arrested. A lot of Jewish comrades were involved in that struggle too, and in support. And when Leon Davis was released from prison, Malcolm X and joined A. Philip Randolph and a lot of other prominent civil rights activists to speak on behalf of 1199. And what Malcolm said to me is just prophetic. What he said when he was on the speaker's podium is he said, when Puerto Rican and Negro workers can get together and organize, they have the power, and they should not allow themselves to be kicked around by these capitalist bosses. And Malcolm used the term capitalism, by the way, and he became increasingly a socialist because of his understanding of the way this exploitative system works. So, I mean, those are just a few examples. If you look at so I taught, the CIO in the 30s, the rise of public sector unionism in the 60s, especially, it's impossible to understand those two movements without understanding the role of Latinx workers, especially women. The women organizers, people like Luisa Moreno, people like Emmentana Ayuka, who was such a great organizer of the Pecan Shelling Workers Union, 11,000 workers strong, Teresa, in San Antonio, Texas. And again, some of my grandparents' generation participated in those movements in the 30s.
Well, Dolores Huerta.
Exactly.
Prominent in DSA as well.
Yes. And really, I think Dolores Huerta is a great example, Teresa, of a person who, when we talk about like intersectional, a person who understands, racism, class oppression, great analysis of capitalism, great analysis of the exploitation of women, which is at the center of the system, and the exploitation and anti-LGBT bigotry. And this is something that Dolores Huerta used her work and her identity, as a great leader of the United Farm Worker Union to speak out against all forms of oppression and to talk about what we used to call the unity of oppression, right? And Dolores is a person who's beloved in the farm worker movement. Another person who's beloved, by the way, who just passed away is Reverend Jesse Jackson. When you think about Dolores, though, you think about a person who didn't grow up. I mean, Dolores didn't grow up as a farm worker. And this is another key lesson behind Latinx working class history is that because the struggles of Latinx workers have been so deeply embedded into American history and so almost like one side, I mean, Latinx workers have very little power unless they've been able to unionize and mobilize. But they've inspired people. They inspired Cesar Chavez, they inspired Dolores, they inspired Jesse Jackson so much that Jesse Jackson became a firm supporter. Anytime Latinx workers went on strike in the 70s or 80s, and when I started as a younger labor organizer, Theresa, Jesse actually came and got arrested at some of our pickets for the Farm Workers Union. He was a person that at the time when the Democratic Party started its neoliberal stuff, Clintonism, we need to be friendly to the bosses, we need to unions are old fashioned and outmoded and reactionary. We need to, join hands with the Walton family. The Clintons, that's what they're big into, right? The Walmart people. People like Dolores, people like Cesar Chavez, people like Jesse Jackson held the line. The other thing that the Latinx working class movement emphasized to us, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, was a critique of neoliberalism. And when I say critique of neoliberalism, I mean that if you look at the unions that came out against the North American Free Trade Agreement or NAFTA, almost all those unions had major components or major segments were composed of Latinx workers. These were people who had experienced the realities of capitalism firsthand, the realities of free trade firsthand. These were workers from Mexico, from Central America, from the Caribbean, from West Africa. And so they could tell you exactly what was going to happen with NAFTA. You didn't have to be, I'll use the phrase, I know my colleagues in science hate it. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist, Theresa, in the early 90s to know what NAFTA was going to do to us, to the working class in this country, in the US, in Mexico, in the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. And it was their experiential understanding of capitalism that drove Latinx workers to tell their unions, we should be opposed to this. Y'all, this is not going to bode well for small farmers in Mexico, for example. Unfortunately, we didn't listen to them. And we got this mess NAFTA, which now everyone says they were opposed to, but I know better because I can tell you we had picket lines, we had people getting arrested, fighting the North American Free Trade Agreement. And now some of these people who say they're opposed to it, back then, Theresa, were squarely behind it.
In fact, I remember young DSAers going south of the border and, doing videos in the maquiladoras.
Mm-hmm.
That was the word. Maybe for the newest audience, you should say a word about them.
Yeah, about the early
Well,
Mexican socialists, or
no, I meant about what the maquiladoras were.
okay, yeah. Well, because connected to this, and again, people, the thing to understand about neoliberalism, kind of underlying the maquiladora system, was that it was a bipartisan movement among Republicans and Democrats. Workers would benefit by reducing any kind of restraints on trade, setting up these new factories in just south of the U.S.-Mexico border called maquiladoras. Most of the workers in those plants, by the way, Theresa, were women and frankly children or teenagers. And interestingly enough, this is a recapitulation, as it were, about capitalism, because the early capitalist factories in this country were designed to employ who? Mainly women and children. And that's very revealing about this system of exploitation. So you fast forward to maquiladoras. I remember as a younger labor organizer, we would have a lot of these fact-finding missions where members of the labor movement in the US would go. I never participated in one of these fact-finding missions, but they would go firsthand to see these experiences. They would have workers come to the US, again, primarily, if memory serves, women giving testimony about how these so-called free trade zones and part of the maquiladora, I mean, it's a very complex system, but to make a long story short, part of the benefit to capital was you could set up a factory in one of these free trade zones and pay little or no taxes. you were exempt from labor laws, from Mexican labor laws, which actually are very robust, in some ways more robust than American or US labor laws. And again, you had people like Dolores Huerta speaking out against NAFTA, Jesse Jackson speaking out against NAFTA. Most of the dissident Mexican labor movement, most of the non-governmental labor unions in Mexico spoke out against NAFTA. And it was just amazing to me in retrospect. But another connected thing too, Teresa, I had to say this is that if you look at socialism, and again, I'm so glad that Ithaca DSA has this wonderful program. The history of socialism really, again, Latinx workers have played a central role. If you look at recent works on the Mexican Revolution, for example, and the ways in which members of the industrial workers of the world, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the IWW, because many of those organizers, especially in the South and Florida and Texas and Southern California, were Mexican or Central American or Cuban. And if you think of people like Jose Marti or Luisa Moreno, not all of them were strictly socialist in terms of maybe they weren't members of the Socialist Party, but they were very anti-capitalist. And the Mexican Revolution, at the core of it, one really important tendency was anti-capitalism and communism. A lot of those organizers ended up in the US, and many of them, by the way, ended up in Fort Leavenworth because they were in prison. As you know, if you were a communist and you came out against World War One in this so-called free country, what a joke! You can be put in prison for just being against a war. Thousands of them were. Many of those prisoners who spoke out against World War One, we know the most famous one, Eugene Debs. We should never forget him. But under him, there were thousands of IWWs, of Quakers, of pacifists. But again, I don't want us to forget that many of those anti-war, pro-labor, internationalist workers. And I guess that's what I want us to remember even to this day. My argument today is that Latinx workers today in Minneapolis, in Seattle, in Austin, in Miami, are people who are modeling these very traditional labor solidarity values, internationalism, mutual aid, and this is part and unionism. There's been a surge in Latinx union membership for the past 15 years, and for these reasons, this current administration, the Trump administration, sees Latino workers as threats to the status quo.
Yes, and perhaps to bring things to the present, as you pretty much have, say something about Minneapolis and what happened.
Minneapolis, yeah, I mean the movement in Minneapolis is remarkable. Again, Latinx workers at the center of it, but also one of the things that made it possible, and I'm thinking of January 23rd. That was the day of the big strike, right? And I think a lot of your listeners will be familiar with that. It's important for us to remember as organizers how that was possible. So you had a lot of neighborhoods organized, neighborhood by neighborhood, Latinos, Somalian neighborhoods, African American neighborhoods, some of which had come together during the George Floyd protests in 2020. So I talked to some organizers in Minneapolis when I was working on this article like last year, and they said, we were ready for ICE because we could use the same tactics we used against the cops to mobilize during the George Floyd protests. And Latinx workers, I mean, if Latinx workers had not been putting up resistance to ICE and to the Border Patrol, none of these movements would be happening, right? I mean, basically, what I found when I worked on this article was that movements preceding Minneapolis were in cities like Cincinnati, St. Louis, Tacoma, South Chicago, Los Angeles. I mean, specific neighborhoods were so well organized against ICE in South Chicago. This was 6 months before, or about 4 or 5 months before Minneapolis, Teresa. Remember the abysmal Tom Homan got on and was whining. He said these South Chicago neighborhoods have learned how to defeat us, and how outrageous that was. Because the ICE agents couldn't get any traction there. They couldn't get served in restaurants. Tow trucks would show up mysteriously and tow their ICE vehicles away out of nowhere. People would snub them. They thought they would be welcomed as heroes. Oh, we're coming here to deport your workers, so you should treat us like heroes, right? And I guess so. I realize I'm kind of disjointed right now, but I want to share with you is that Minneapolis is we owe so much to the organizers in Minneapolis, but Minneapolis is part of a nationwide movement. You see this in regions, like I mentioned, St. Louis. St. Louis is worth a minute. These are neighborhoods, Teresa, by the way, that began organizing the moment that Trump got elected, and they were organizing hunger strikes, sit down, walkouts. And what was interesting about these movements, Teresa, even I'm talking about like no, mid-November 2024, is that Hispanic-owned businesses began participating, Anglo-owned businesses began participating. And one of the things they did was in St. Louis, there was like a whole block of Hispanic-owned businesses, restaurants, culinary shops, nail, salons, the whole 9 yards. And we're actually giving their workers the day off or days off to go protest. And businesses themselves were actually calling boycotts and saying to their Anglo counterparts or their Anglo neighbors, hey, if you don't like us, then try to run your economy without us and see how that works
Yeah.
out. And I want to say that, DSA stepped to the fore. Like everywhere I looked, and talking to movement friends and doing research, you would see, DSA members right in the thick of things and participating and really being good. I'm going to use a term we don't often use in the movement enough, but I think it's critical, being good followers. That is, we talk a lot about in the movement about leadership, but socialism isn't about leadership. It's about the rank and file. It's about the working people. It's about like us. And so the DSA organizers that were active in St. Louis and Cincinnati and some of these smaller kind of, I mean, those aren't small cities, right? But again, very active in kind of finding out first what was needed. You saw the same thing in Minneapolis. Movement organizations and labor unions and the good socialist organizations deferred to neighborhood organizers, said, you're the ones who are under stress by ICE. Like we can leave, like Veterans for Peace can go to Minneapolis for a week and then go back home to wherever they're from. But the people that live in Minneapolis have got to stay there. And so I think that was a good example of building. But at the root of it, again, if Latinx workers hadn't resisted first, I just don't see how those movements could have blossomed. If we didn't have the George Floyd protests in 2020, 2021, we wouldn't have had enough experience on how to fight the officer, the police block by block.
Perhaps you could say something now about how government attacks on immigrants relate to Trump's attacks on higher education.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways. I mean, one is my colleague Juan Gonzalez, who's been a member of the Young Lords back in the 60s and is also, your listeners will recognize him as the person who co-anchors Democracy Now!, right? So Juan Gonzalez has written a book called Harvest of Empire, and Juan is Puerto Rican. And so Puerto Rico is the most, by the way, Puerto Rico is the most valuable colony in the history of modern capitalism. The U.S. has sucked more value out of Puerto Rico than any other colony that the British or French even dreamed of. And so Juan Gonzalez came up with the notion of harvest of empire to say that people don't just come to the US because they want to live a better way of life. You hear that as a cliche all the time. A lot of times people come here because they have no other choice, because we've turned their countries into war zones, or in Puerto Rico, we forced farmers off the land so that Dow and Union Carbide can have these massive factory complexes and depopulate the countryside. So understanding the U.S. as an empire allows us to connect the oppression of working class people in countries like Puerto Rico or like even Ithaca with the situation on our campuses now. Because remember that many workers on our campuses are immigrants. They're Latinx workers. If you look at construction, who, like when I taught at the University of Florida, I used to tell, I had colleagues who were very, well, Paul, I don't agree with illegal immigration. And I would say, who's going to build the chemistry building? Who's going to refurbish the physics building? Who's going to rebuild your lab? It's going to be so-called undocumented workers. And remembering that the U.S. as an empire allows us to understand why these attacks have been occurring against both Latinx workers off campus, but also on campus. And, when we had students courageously protesting in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza and protesting against war and against genocide, that endangers the empire. When Latinx workers go on strike and speak out and say that, we have a value beyond our immigration status, that also endangers the empire. And this is one of the reasons why, the empire strikes back, right? To use that Star Wars metaphor. And the empire doesn't always strike back in logical, concise ways. There's a lot of, wishy-washiness. A good socialist understands that the ruling class is never completely marching in lock and step, right? There are divisions between, like right now, even there's divisions between these capitalist gangsters who support tariffs and capitalist gangsters who don't support tariffs. But they're both gangsters. It's just that one supports tariffs and one's opposed to tariffs. And we let sometimes, I think some of those arguments kind of distract us a little bit from the fact that capitalism is an untenable system. It just doesn't work. And this is a reason why, Theresa, I think that Latinx workers have been the target, part of the reason why they've been the target of so much repression. People, the government doesn't want you to see them. They don't want you to notice the fact that you can't, I can't even go downtown and get a meal. I can't have my maintenance done on my building at Cornell, one of the richest universities in the country, without so-called undocumented workers. Keep them in the closet, keep them quiet, and don't let out the secret that capitalism doesn't work. If it did work, then we wouldn't be trying to destroy Cuba or even Venezuela. If anyway, I know I'm
Yeah.
starting to ramble a little bit.
Okay. And thank you, Paul Ortiz, for talking about the role of Latinx workers in the United States. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.